The cradle of the Tudor dynasty was not a place of warmth, but of cold, calculating politics, and its first architect was a child who had her own childhood stolen from her. Before there was the glittering court of Henry VIII, there was the blood-soaked birth of his father, a birth that nearly killed a 13-year-old girl. This is the story of Margaret Beaufort, a figure whose life was forged in the fires of the Wars of the Roses, a pawn who learned to become a queen in all but name. Her story begins not with glory, but with survival, a relentless fight for existence that would shape the destiny of England itself. Born into the powerful but precarious House of Beaufort, a branch of the royal House of Lancaster, Margaret's blood was both her greatest asset and her most dangerous burden. From her earliest moments, she was a piece on the chessboard of English power, her value measured solely in the alliances she could secure. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died when she was just a year old. Under a cloud of suspicion that loomed over her family, whispers of suicide after military disgrace. This left Margaret in the care of her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, a woman who understood the savage rules of their world. Survival meant adaptability, and for a noblewoman, that meant a profitable marriage. By the age of 6, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, the son of the powerful Duke of Suffolk. It was a contract, a transaction binding two great families. But in the volatile landscape of 15th century England, where the rival houses of York and Lancaster were sharpening their blades for a conflict that would become known as the Wars of the Roses, alliances could shatter in an instant. Suffolk fell from grace, accused of treason for his role in losing English territories in France, and was murdered on a ship in the English Channel. His death rendered Margaret's first betrothal worthless. The Beaufort women, however, were nothing if not resilient. With the swiftness demanded by the times, a new, more politically expedient match was secured. Margaret, now around 12 years old, was married to Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. Edmund was a man in his 20s, a half-brother to the mentally fragile King Henry VI through their mother's secret marriage. The Tudors were considered Welsh upstarts by the ancient nobility, but they possessed the king's favour, and that was currency enough. The wedding, held at Margaret's childhood home of Bletsoe Castle, was a ceremony devoid of the romance it might have portrayed in songs. It was a strategic union, sealing a political alliance with vows a child could barely comprehend. The consummation of the marriage was immediate and brutal. In an age where noble girls were treated as broodmares for dynastic ambition, there was no concept of waiting for physical or emotional maturity. The wedding night was a trauma that Margaret would carry with her for the rest of her life, a silent scar that would manifest in her later extreme piety and a flinching fear of physical contact. She was a child handed over to a seasoned man of war and politics. Within months, her body began to change in ways that terrified her. The older women around her spoke in hushed, knowing tones, their faces a mixture of anticipation for a potential heir and deep concern for such a young mother. She was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. But the security this marriage was meant to provide proved as fragile as the first. The Wars of the Roses were erupting in earnest. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against the Yorkist forces, Edmund Tudor was captured. The circumstances were murky, wrapped in the fog of civil war. Whether he died of the plague in his damp prison cell or was quietly murdered by his captors remains one of history's grim mysteries. The news reached Margaret at Lamphay Palace in Pembrokeshire. A messenger arrived on a rain-swept November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride. Margaret was in the chapel, praying for her husband's safe return, when the sound of his boots echoed on the stone floor behind her. She knew, before he even spoke, that her world had shattered once again. At 13, she was a widow, heavily pregnant, and utterly alone in a kingdom sliding into chaos. The Lancastrian cause her husband had died for was crumbling. Her sole protector now was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, a man of loyalty and pragmatism. He understood that Margaret carried not just a child, but the potential future of the Tudor line. He brought her to his formidable stronghold, Pembroke Castle, a massive stone fortress perched on the cliffs of Wales, where the Atlantic waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. The journey was an ordeal in itself. The winter roads were treacherous, a morass of frozen mud and obstacles. Margaret, in her advanced pregnancy, travelled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain and fear through her swollen frame. The remote castle, for all its defensive might, was a cold and draughty refuge. Its great chambers were hung with tapestries to block the wind that whistled through ancient stones, a feeble defense against the brutal winter of 1456. Here, In this isolated fortress, a child was about to give birth to a child. An event that would forever alter the course of English history. The brutal Welsh winter of 1456 to 1457 howled around Pembroke Castle, its stone walls offering little comfort to the 13-year-old widow trapped within. Margaret Beaufort's time had come. The child, who had been a political bargaining chip, a wife, and a widow, was now facing the ultimate trial of womanhood, one her body was tragically unprepared to endure. The labor began with a pain so sharp and profound it stole the breath from her lungs. She had been walking the battlements, as the physician advised, when the first contraction ripped through her small frame, doubling her over against the cold, unforgiving stone. Her attending ladies rushed to her side, their faces masks of practiced calm that did little to hide their deep-seated fear. They knew, as did everyone in the castle, that the survival of both mother and child hung by a thread. The chamber prepared for the birth was a scene of grim determination. Dame Gwenllian, the head midwife with decades of experience, directed the others with a quiet authority. Her weathered face was grave as she examined Margaret. The diagnosis was as feared. The baby was large and badly positioned, and Margaret's hips, those of a girl still growing, were too narrow. The air grew thick with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, and the whispered prayers of the women. For 18 agonizing hours, Margaret labored. Her screams, initially sharp and terrified, faded into raw, animalistic grunts of effort and pain. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood and sweat, trying everything in their arsenal to turn the baby and guide it into the world. They massaged, changed positions, and administered herbal potions, but the progress was negligible. The castle physician, Dr. Lewis Carlion, was summoned, his presence a stark admission of the dire situation. He confirmed the midwife's fears. An internal examination revealed extensive tearing, and the baby was in severe distress. Outside the chamber, Jasper Tudor paced the cold corridors, the echoes of Margaret's suffering a constant reminder of the political and personal stakes. The future of the Tudor name, the last flicker of Lancastrian hope in this branch, was being decided in that room. He heard the desperate whispers of the servants fetching endless basins of hot water and clean linens, their expressions telling him more than any report could. Inside, Dame Gwenllian made the terrible decision. To save the child, they would have to attempt a manual extraction, a procedure that often sacrificed the mother. As she prepared to reach inside the shattered young body, she sent a silent prayer to Street, Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. The final moments were a blur of tearing flesh and unimaginable pain for Margaret. Then, suddenly, it was over. The baby was pulled from her body in a final, violent surge. A terrifying silence filled the chamber, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Margaret's ragged, shallow breaths. The infant was pale, limp, and silent. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the entire ordeal had been for nothing. Then, Dame Gwenllian cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and a thin, furious wail pierced the air. It was the cry of Henry Tudor. Margaret, drifting in and out of consciousness through a haze of pain and blood loss, heard her son's first sound. She tried to reach for him, but her arms were leaden. Dame Gwenllian placed the swaddled infant on Margaret's chest for a fleeting moment, a mere formality before rushing him away to be cleaned. Margaret's eyes, dark with exhaustion and trauma, followed her son, desperately trying to memorize the features of the child for whom she had almost died. The damage to Margaret's body was catastrophic and permanent. Dr. Carlion's subsequent examination revealed internal injuries from which she would never fully recover. The birth had torn her apart, leaving her barren at the age of 13. Her reproductive life, the very reason for her political value, had been sacrificed in a single, traumatic event. The physical recovery was agonizingly slow. For weeks, she hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection. She was fed spoonfuls of broth and fortified wine, her body too weak to even sit up. Dame Gwenllian rarely left her side, a constant guardian in the shadowy chamber, but the psychological wounds cut even deeper. The trauma manifested in violent nightmares that left her screaming in the dead of night. She developed a profound fear of physical contact, flinching away from the gentlest touch of her caretakers. Her relationship with her newborn son was complex and painful. She loved him with a ferocious intensity, but the mere act of holding him could trigger overwhelming flashbacks of the violence of his birth. Yet, within that broken body, an iron will was hardening. As the faint Welsh spring light began to filter through the castle windows, Margaret's spirit, though scarred, proved unbroken. Lying in her sickbed, she began to display the calculating intelligence that would define her legacy. She understood with chilling clarity that her son, Henry, was now the embodiment of all her ambition and the last hope of the Tudor line. He was no longer just a child. He was a cause. Her own motherhood had been stolen from her twice, first by her youth and forced marriage, and now by physical trauma. But in its place, a new purpose was born. Not merely to be a mother, but to be the architect of a king. She began to use her limited strength to learn, questioning Jasper about the shifting allegiances of the noble houses and the progress of the Civil War. She was no longer a pawn. The girl who had screamed in the birthing chamber was gone, replaced by a woman who had stared into the abyss and decided to master the game that had almost destroyed her. The world outside Pembroke Castle was drenched in blood, a chessboard where kings were toppled and nobles slaughtered with grim regularity. For Margaret Beaufort, survival was no longer a personal matter. It was a strategic imperative for her son's future. The new mother, her body forever broken but her will tempered to steel, understood that sentimentality was a luxury that led to the block. Her first move in the great game was one of cold pragmatism. In 1458, barely a year after her near-fatal childbirth, and while still physically fragile, she married Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of the Duke of Buckingham. This was no union of hearts. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer, a stark contrast to her Lancastrian roots. The wedding was a quiet, somber affair, a business transaction designed for one purpose: protection. For Margaret, it meant a shield for herself, and, crucially, for her son's inheritance, the valuable Beaufort estates. For Stafford, it was an alliance with a name that still carried weight, even if its loyalties were suspect. This marriage was Margaret's true education. While her body remained delicate, her mind expanded with voracious intensity. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics from within the enemy's camp. She mastered the art of managing vast estates, reading complex legal documents, and understanding the intricate web of debts and loyalties that bound the nobility. Her library grew into a renowned collection, filled with works on law, theology, and history. She became a scholar of power, studying its application not from a distance, but from the very heart of the Yorkist regime that held the throne. Meanwhile, her son, Henry, remained in Wales under the guardianship of his uncle Jasper Tudor. This separation was a constant, aching wound. She saw her boy only rarely, their relationship maintained through carefully coded letters and the occasional gift. He was growing into a stranger, raised in the rugged Welsh marches, while she perfected the art of dissimulation in English castles. She poured her stifled maternal love into a cold, focused ambition, to one day see that distant son elevated to a position beyond the reach of his enemies. The political landscape shifted with violent suddenness. The Yorkist claimant, Edward IV, seized the throne after the bloody Battle of Towton in 1461, a confrontation so brutal it was said the rivers ran red. The Lancastrian cause was shattered, its leadership dead or in exile. King Henry VI was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For Margaret, this was a period of unbearable tension. Her Lancastrian blood made her a permanent person of interest to the new regime. Every knock on the door could be the one that brought soldiers coming for her son. She developed an elaborate intelligence network, bribing messengers, courting servants, and cultivating informants to know the king's mind before the king himself did. This constant vigilance was the price of her son's life. Her husband, Henry Stafford, was wounded fighting for the Yorkists at the Battle of Edgecote in 1469. The injury left him embittered and frail. Margaret, playing the dutiful wife, nursed him through his long convalescence, and in the quiet hours by his sickbed, she began her most subtle work. She never openly criticized Edward IV. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, sharing stories of Yorkist ingratitude and the king's fickle nature. She preyed on Stafford's wounded pride, slowly, patiently eroding his loyalty until he became receptive to the idea of shifting his allegiance. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a testament to how far the once helpless girl had come. In 1470, the unthinkable happened. The Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who had put Edward IV on the throne, turned against him and restored the hapless Henry VI. For a fleeting, glorious moment, the Lancastrian sun shone again. Margaret dared to hope. Perhaps her son could return from Wales. Perhaps her long, patient game was nearing its end. But the restoration was short-lived. Edward IV returned with an army, and in the spring of 1471, he crushed the Lancastrians for good. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, the last direct heir of Henry VI, was killed. Days later, The deposed King Henry VI himself died mysteriously in the Tower. With the direct Lancastrian line extinguished, the political calculus of England changed in an instant. Suddenly, Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, was no longer just a nobleman with a faint claim. He was the most prominent surviving Lancastrian claimant to the throne. His bloodline, once a liability, was now a death warrant. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the immediate and mortal danger, made a desperate decision. He and his 14-year-old nephew would not wait to be hunted down. They would flee. The news reached Margaret days later, a second devastating blow following the death of the Lancastrian hope. Her son, the child for whom she had sacrificed her body and plotted her life, was gone, a fugitive sailing into the unknown, towards a 14-year exile in Brittany. The separation was now absolute, severed by the English Channel and the implacable hatred of a king. Standing in her English chambers, Margaret felt the final ties of her old life snap. The mother was gone, only the strategist remained. Her grief did not dissolve. It crystallized into something harder and more determined than ever before. The game was now for the highest stake imaginable, the crown itself. For 14 long years, Margaret Beaufort's life was a masterclass in patient, calculated conspiracy. Her son, Henry Tudor, was a ghost across the sea in Brittany, a permanent exile whose survival was a daily uncertainty. Margaret, now married to her third husband, Thomas Stanley, had chosen her partner with the precision of a general selecting a key ally. Stanley was a master of realpolitik, a man whose loyalty was to power itself, and Margaret bound him to her cause with the immense Beaufort wealth and the tantalizing prospect of unparalleled influence should her plan succeed. Their marriage was the engine of her ambition, and she used its cover to build a spy network of remarkable sophistication. Informants in royal households, merchants carrying coded messages, and sympathetic clergy formed a web of intelligence that stretched from the English coast deep into Brittany. She knew the movements of Yorkist troops, the mood of the court, and the health of King Edward IV better than most of his own advisors. Her entire existence was a performance of loyalty to the Yorkist crown, while beneath the surface, she tirelessly wove the threads of its destruction. The sudden death of Edward IV in 1483 was the crack in the foundation she had been waiting for. His brother Richard of Gloucester seized the throne, imprisoning the young Edward V and his brother in the Tower of London, where they vanished from history. Richard III's usurpation, shrouded in the suspicion of child murder, shattered the stability of the Yorkist regime and turned the tide of public opinion. Margaret saw her moment. The distant, complicated Lancastrian claim of her son now appeared as a righteous alternative to a perceived usurper. With breathtaking audacity, she began to coordinate a full-scale rebellion from her English estates, working in secret with allies like Bishop John Morton. She funded the plot, secured promises of support from disaffected nobles, and arranged for Henry to invade from Brittany. The plan was a masterpiece of coordination, but it was betrayed. The rebellion collapsed in the autumn of 1483, and its leaders were executed. Margaret's world should have ended then. Arrested for high treason, she was stripped of her titles and all her lands, which were transferred to her husband, Stanley, a move by Richard III to control her without provoking the powerful Stanley family. She was placed under house arrest, but not in a dungeon. Instead, she was confined to the luxurious prisons of Stanley Estates, a queen in a gilded cage. Yet, even from captivity, her will proved indomitable. Cut off from direct control, she manipulated the one man who could still reach the levers of power, her husband. Through whispered counsel and calculated persuasion, she worked on Stanley's ambitions and his fears, ensuring that while he publicly served King Richard, his loyalty remained fatally ambiguous. She was playing for the highest stakes, knowing a single misstep meant the block for her, and death in exile for her son. The final act began in August 1485. Henry Tudor, armed with ships, mercenaries, and the unwavering belief his mother had fostered in him through years of secret letters, landed at Milford Haven. As Henry marched inland, Richard III called his armies, including the forces of Thomas Stanley. The stage was set for the Battle of Bosworth Field. On that foggy morning of August 22, Margaret's decades of planning, her political marriages, her vast expenditures, and her intricate web of alliances all converged on a single, muddy field in Leicestershire. The Stanley forces, crucial to both sides, held back, watching. As the battle raged, Richard III, seeing victory slipping away, launched a desperate cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. It was the moment of truth. Margaret's lifelong investment in the Stanley family paid its ultimate dividend. Lord Stanley gave the order, and his forces turned on the king, crashing into Richard's flank and sealing his fate. Richard III was cut down, and the crown, literally retrieved from a thorn bush, was placed upon the head of Henry VII. Margaret's ambition was realized. The son she had nearly died bringing into the world, whom she had nurtured from a terrifying distance, was King of England. The mother and son were reunited after a separation of 14 years, a meeting that must have been as profoundly awkward as it was emotionally charged. They were strangers bound by blood, and a shared monumental purpose now achieved. Margaret was granted the unprecedented title of My Lady the King's Mother, and became the most powerful woman in the realm, a trusted advisor and a formidable presence in her son's court. She had founded the Tudor dynasty, a line that would produce Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, reshaping England and the world. Yet, the cost of this triumph was etched into her very being. The 13-year-old girl who had screamed in the birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle was gone, replaced by a figure of immense power and profound sacrifice. She had traded her body, her motherhood, and her personal happiness for a crown. When she died in 1509, just days after her son Henry VII, she left behind a legacy of iron will and political genius. The Wars of the Roses were ended, and the Tudor age began, not with a battle cry, but with the silent, relentless determination of a mother who refused to be a pawn, and instead moved the kings herself. Thank you for following this incredible journey of survival and ambition. If you were captivated by the story of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of the Tudor dynasty, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden figures who shaped history. We love hearing from you, so let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like us to explore next.